Hello and welcome to Comedy in a Nutshell, where we launch into the galaxy of laughter and explore the cosmos of comedy, charting the constellations of influence and the black holes of personal experience that have shaped our guests' comedic universe. Because in comedy, every laugh is light years in the making. Blast off! I'm the comedy nerd who's seen more than 1,500 comedians perform live comedy, and you can find out more about my journey in comedy fandom on my website, thecomedynerd.com. If you like to hear what comedians have to say as much as I do, then please like, subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. Thank you. My guest this episode is a comedian who's been performing character comedy since 2020, a year in which we all developed alternative personalities. An increasingly familiar sight on the alternative comedy circuit, it's comedian Nick Kirk. Was comedy like something that was really influential on you when you were growing up?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Like I've always been a comedy nerd, not the comedy nerd, obviously, trademark. But yeah, always been a comedy nerd. That comes from like the family. The family are always big comedy people. Like I used to, we'd go around to my nana and granddad on my dad's side, and like with my granddad, we'd sit and watch things like Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy and Harold Lloyd and Morecambe and Wise and kind of all the kind of classics. He would also sit with us and like happily watch Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, like humor's always been like a big part of the family life. And yeah, all my kind of influences came from grandparents, parents on down. Like from about the age of 8 or 9, they were showing us stuff like Blazing Saddles and Airplane and things like that because the attitude was, well, they're just funny.
Yeah.
My parents always had the attitude of, I don't mind if they see kind of nudity, sex, things like that at a young age. I just don't want them exposed to violence, which I think is probably a healthy way round to look at it. Unusually so. So we would see things like, Airplane that would have a bit of brief nudity in it and stuff like that. They didn't mind that sort of thing.
Yeah.
They knew you would get the humor. That was the important thing. So I've always been like a comedy guy.
Did you have influences that far back that sort of made you interested in comedy as part of like something for the future?
Yeah, I think so. I think like probably the early influences would be written ones. So definitely as a kid, it was things like Roald Dahl and Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and Spike Milligan. My mum's a big Spike Milligan fan, so we had lots of things like Silly Verse for Kids, Book of Milliganimals, all that sort of stuff. And I just loved silly wordplay. Anything with like funny sounding words, silly puns, all that sort of stuff as a kid. I loved all of that. So probably like written word. There was always a part of me, I think, that wanted to be a writer. Since I've been a kid, I've always had it in my head that I would be a writer. And I've always written stuff over the years, long before doing comedy. I always wrote just in my spare time, just personally. I think kind of writing was the first influence. But then as we got older, it was things like Monty Python was a big early influence. Again, that comes from the folks. They were Python fans.
Yeah.
They'd been fans growing up. So that was the sort of stuff we watched. Tons of like 80s sitcoms as well. Blackadder, Young Ones. They got us into those fairly early on. Red Dwarf. I remember my mum came home from school. My mum said, I taped something that was on last night. I think you'd like it. It's this new sci-fi thing. And it's a comedy and it's Red Dwarf. And yeah, that was the sort of first episode. And I was hooked from there. And probably along those times, the other big influence was Douglas Adams. So I found Hitchhikers at quite a young age.
Yeah.
And that was a huge influence on me. I mean, the other nerdy side to me is sci-fi nerd, very much. So
yeah.
I always thought I was more of a sci-fi nerd, but I think I'm more of a comedy nerd, quite honestly.
I met Douglas Adams once many years ago.
Oh, no, I'm jealous of that.
Yeah, I went to a book signing. I had the 2 volumes of Dirk Gently in my bag, and I went to get a Hitchhiker's book signed. It was a launch event for Mostly Harmless, the 5th book in the trilogy. So that would have been about 92, I think. And I said, could you sign these as well?
Yeah.
But but he was so lovely as you'd expect. But yeah, a big influence. I love Hitchhiker's Guide always, and I read those books when I was very young, I guess. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, same. It was the sort of books, radio series, TV series, all of that. I sort of consumed every version of it that I could find.
Yeah. What was it, do you think, that made you want to go into comedy for yourself?
I think there'd always been a part of me that liked the idea of doing comedy,
Yeah.
but I think there'd been a bigger part of my brain at the front saying, you can have fun with your mates and you can muck around and you can make your mates laugh and they make you laugh.
Yeah.
But I don't think you could stand up in front of a room full of strangers and make them laugh. I think that was the big bit of the brain that said that. That all changed when I don't know if you remember it, but in about 2020 there was this whole massive global pandemic thing where we all got locked in our rooms for about a year.
Was there?
Yeah.
I don't go out much anyway, so probably just passed me by.
Really? Oh, it's big news at the time. You should look it up. There's probably loads of stuff about it on the internet.
I'll look into that.
Yeah, a global pandemic is what you want to look for.
Pandemic. Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and I'd already had a subscription to the comedy streaming service Next Up before the pandemic hit. And during the pandemic, they started doing Zoom-based comedy shows, which I know some comedians were not keen on, not the same as doing a live gig. But there are a number who are like, this is all we've got and we should do something. So I started getting into Zoom comedy. As a result of that, I found Stu Goldsmith's Infinite Sofa, which was the sort of comedy talk show that he was doing on Twitch. And part of that was he had an audience who took part on Zoom. So he would have 12 people. You'd join the Zoom room. It would randomly pick 12 of you. So you'd all sit in a rating room and 12 of you would randomly get on. So I started doing that. I started taking part in the show. He also had a writer's room in the morning for the show where you could suggest ideas that would get used in the show. And I started to see things I'd suggested turn up in the show. And then I'd start to interact with the comedians in the show. And I started to enjoy that. And, you know, I started to enjoy other people being funny, but also people seemed to find some of the stuff I was doing funny. So as a result of that, I started taking part in other online shows. I took part in Colin Holt's Anna Man show. I often made like fake Anna autobiography covers for him to then sort of throw to give him a bit of material to work with. So he quite liked that. And as a result of that, I did an online course in improv just to be better at being part of a comedy show. I enjoyed being in these shows and I wanted to be better at being part of them. It's an ensemble thing. As part of the kind of Stu Goldsmith Infinite Sofa thing, there was a little online group of us who were sort of regularly communicating with each other and hanging out in Zoom calls to sort of get through the pandemic. And there came the suggestion of, well, why don't we set up an online show for people who want to try some stand-up out? And that was facilitated by a mutual friend of ours and funny stand-up comedian Leslie Gold. She set that up. And she sort of nudged me and said, oh, I think you should do it. I think you'd be good at doing stand-up. I sort of resisted initially, saying, I don't think I could write something funny. But she persisted and said, I think you should try it. I agreed. I did it. We had because it was this nice supportive online community, we had about 60 people on that first Zoom call, which was a lot. And I did my first set and they laughed. And nearly 4 years later, here I am still doing comedy. So it definitely wasn't it wasn't a plan. It was something that came out of a bizarre and unique set of circumstances that I don't think would have led me to comedy in any other way. I think it would have just been something at the back of my mind saying, oh, it'd be nice to do, but there wouldn't have been something that pushed me to do it. If not for COVID-19.
Well, it's interesting there because you talk about you did an improv course, and obviously a lot of comedians, a lot won't, but a lot will do a course, but usually with a view to support their comedy. But you're saying that you did a course even though you didn't really want to do comedy, you just wanted to be better at that online that you were doing.
Yeah. I think it was just about trying to free myself up to be more responsive and more in the moment when I was on those kind of calls and not freezing up, or because I found what I was doing sometimes on those calls was worrying about being funny.
Yeah.
And I think what doing an improv course did was it unlocked something in my head that said, you don't have to be funny. You just have to say something.
Right.
And someone else might make something funny out of it.
Mm.
And that was like a little key that turned something in the head to say, oh, okay, there isn't like a right way to do this.
Yeah.
In improv terms, the only wrong thing you can do is nothing. And even then, someone might still make something out of that.
Yeah.
But generally, do something because you can't get it wrong. And that started me down the path of, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think when then Leslie came to me, I was like, well, try it because it doesn't matter if you get it wrong because nobody knows what right is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So again, another thing I often ask people is about like stepping out on stage for the first time. And obviously, although we will talk about that, your first time wasn't on the stage at all. It was online.
Yeah.
There must have been two very different experiences, I imagine.
Yes. And I think one helped the other.
Mm.
But what helped? So somebody's like, yeah, like I said, my first one was on a Zoom call, was my first gig. And in fact, my first 20, 25 gigs were all on Zoom. But for that first one on Zoom, I was nervous. Obviously, I was still nervous. I was still worried. You know, I spent all that day going over and over the material, saying it again and again to make sure I had it down and I knew it and I knew what I was saying.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's still that fear that, you know, is it funny and will people laugh? That fear was still there.
Yeah.
But I guess what helped was I knew a lot of the people that were on the call. I knew that they were a supportive audience. I knew that if it went badly, all I had to do was switch off my camera and shut my laptop and I was at home. And I didn't have to see anyone or speak to anyone after the gig if it didn't go well. I could just switch that off. So that was the advantage of doing it on Zoom. Then yes, about 5 months after that, when things started to ease up, I did my first live gig. And again, so I was nervous because it was doing it in front of an audience with people in the room in front of you, which is a very different experience to doing it on Zoom.
Yeah.
But I think what helped was I wasn't nervous about doing the material or the material itself because I'd done it online and I knew people laughed at it and found it funny. So I had that element of, I knew for the first time I was doing it live on stage, I wasn't going to do brand new material. I was going to do material I'd done before,
Right.
because at least I knew that had worked. So it stood a good chance of working in front of a live audience.
Yeah.
And the nice thing was at the end of that, the MC came up to me and said, I can't believe that's your first gig. And I was like, well, it wasn't my first gig, but it was my first live gig, certainly. There were definitely some people who treated Zoom gigs with an element of sniffiness. There was an element of, well, Zoom gigs don't count. You haven't actually done a gig.
Sure. Yeah.
And I get that. It's a very different thing to standing up on stage. But I still think it counts as a gig because it still gives you the opportunity to try material, to learn material. I mean, even though I was doing it on Zoom and I could have had all of my notes in front of me and no one would really have known, I still made an effort to learn the material and perform and deliver it as if I was going up on stage and doing it.
Yeah.
Because I wanted it to be as close as I could get to the real experience of doing stand-up in my bedroom to a camera.
Having started doing comedy then and then on Zoom and then going on to do it live, did you have like particular expectations or was there anything that surprised you?
I think it was more the next step of learning that I had to do, because what I had to then do was learn how to stand on stage and be on stage and handle a microphone and all those kind of things that you normally start doing in parallel when you're getting up and doing the material. I didn't have to do that because I was sat in a chair in front of a camera. And now I was like, okay, I've got to think about how I stand and how I move when I'm doing the material and how I'm dressed fully. I mean, I still put on, like, when I'm doing stand up, I normally wear like a velvet jacket and a shirt and a tie and a waistcoat. It's just, that's the look that seems to work for my persona. And also it makes me feel like I'm doing stand up because I've dressed for it.
Right.
That said, I was only wearing that from, the waist up. I was just wearing shorts and stuff like that and sat around at home. So it's like, well, you've got to fully dress yourself. Because couldn't go out in the shorts and the velvet jacket and say it's a weird look. It's not the vibe I was going for, I don't think. Not at the start, certainly.
So I know you predominantly as a character comic, and we'll talk about some of your characters. Have you been doing character comedy since those Zoom gigs? Was that where you started?
No, no. So probably for the first year and a half, it was just stand up. So stand up. I was going to say regular stand up. I would say mine was probably a little bit meta-ish sometimes, even still as stand up. It tended to be, I guess, stuff I would term, no, without it sounding too slightly wanky, more like thought experiment stuff. It didn't really go into my personal life a lot. My first routine I did about my two nephews, and then actually I thought I don't really want to talk about people who aren't old enough to have like a right to reply. It didn't feel fair to share funny things they did when they don't really have a say in that, and if they, as they grow up, they might not have liked me talking about them. So there's an element of I didn't really want to do too much of that. So I did stuff around, how I looked, but then I started to introduce sort of props and, more elements like that into some of the routines. There was a set of magician scarves that started coming into one of my routines, a little foam squeezy Walter White head that started coming into them. So I started to transition into using props and other stuff as part of the routine rather than it just being necessarily straight stand up, because I was just finding that more fun to play with that. And also because it'd be something that people weren't expecting. So the routine might start off being regular stand up and then suddenly a prop comes out of nowhere, and that always gets a laugh because generally a laugh is an element of surprise. So that tended to work. So for the first year and a half, it was stand up, and then there's a regular sort of open mic gig in London called G&B, and intermittently they run a night called Abandoning the Comfort Zone. And the idea with that night is you go in and you do something you've never done before. And I'd sort of had, in the build up to that, I'd had this rough idea for a character who was this sort of safety guy. And I just thought, wouldn't it be funny if when he's doing his talk, he doesn't really tell you anything about safety. All he does is just bring elements of his personal life into it. And all he's doing is talking about his personal life. And that is kind of where the transition into being a character comedian started. I did that at the Abandoning the Comfort Zone. It went down well. That was the birth of one of my main characters, Dave Steed, who's a depressed safety officer with a horrible personal life. And that routine, which I still do today, is largely unchanged from that first performance. There's lots that's been added to it, and the way I perform him has changed. But the core of the elements of that routine is still there. That's who that character is, and it sums him up quite well in those initial 5 minutes that I did. It gives you a window into him, his ex-wife, his children, and and his ex-wife's new partner, who he clearly doesn't like. And all of that's kind of built out in sort of a very brief 5 minutes, really. I've expanded the routine out to be a longer routine, but the core of it was sort of 5 minutes to start with.
So because you now do character comedy, I mean, one of the things I talked about with people generally is how much of them we see on stage and how much is a character of them. But you're playing other people anyway. You're playing characters. So you've talked about that path, how you got there a little bit, but is it protective? Is it like a uniform? Is it put distance between you and the audience by having someone else sort of in between you? Is there an element of that to you?
I think that's pretty accurate, to be fair. I think there's an element of it's a lot easier to hide behind the character than mine your personal life for material, because you can craft whatever personal life you want for that character, so you can mine whatever you want out of it. Now arguably there's themes amongst a lot of the characters I do, and they touch on the sort of things that are part of me. I mean, there's one character I do which is a routine that started as stand-up, that I tried to do as me, It's a routine about just being sort of slightly pervy about books.
Yeah.
As you can see on this video call, I have something. I have about 3,500 books. I have a problem with books. It's an issue. I haven't read them all. I've read a lot. I haven't read them all. I did this routine, and I think people's reaction was, "Oh, that's just a bit creepy. I don't really like it." So when I started doing character stuff, I thought, well, maybe I can transition that into a sort of, over the top sort of foppish character.
Right.
And I did it as a character, and the response was like, "Oh, he's creepy. Okay, that's quite funny." Arguably, I'm not sure I still have got it to fully work as much as I would like, but I think it works better now as a character than it did doing it as me, putting that extra layer of the character on it.
Yeah.
It's something to it. So probably the characters have an element of either me or something I'm interested in. One of my characters is a supervillain. I'm a huge comic book nerd. I have been since I started reading from the age of 6 or 7, reading UK Marvel reprints of stuff. So doing a supervillain character is just, it's still drawing on stuff I know quite well, rather than not necessarily I guess an aspect of my personality, and an aspect of my personality is comic book nerd. But yeah, I often, this is stuff I guess I've tried to pick out in the show I've put together this year, the show I took up to Edinburgh as a work in progress this year. I've tried to sort of pick out, well, what are the themes amongst these characters? Often they're people who are who have not achieved what they wanted to in life by a certain age. I think that's just sort of general feelings you get when you get to middle age, which I am. I'd say approaching. It's unlikely I'll live to 96. I think I'd probably hit the middle age point at this point. But yeah, I guess they're things that led me to. They're also things that led me to do comedy, because I was probably feeling, well, I haven't achieved what I wanted to by this point in life, and maybe I should do something new and different. But yeah, there's often an element of failure in the characters that I do. Magician character, the great Gorgonzola, who clearly can't do magic, and has a sort of terrible, anxious, nervous energy all the way through, because he just knows it's not going to work. I think it's a particularly British thing, but I think the loser, the failure, is something that we are drawn to and find more amusing. I like to think that, like most of my characters, there's an element of sympathy or empathy that you have for them. Maybe not all of them, but I think my safety guy Dave Steed is clearly a bit of a dick, but I think you do feel some sympathy for the falling apart of his life, even if he may well have deserved some of that. I just think comedy always changes. I think who you are as a comedian just keeps changing. When I started out, it was stand-up. After a year and a half, I started introducing characters, but I still did stand-up. And I'd say it's really only in the last 6 months that I've come to the realization that actually, at the moment, the character stuff is the stuff that I really enjoy and excites me, and the sort of stand-up has fallen by the wayside a little bit.
Right.
But in a year and a half's time, who knows? Maybe I'll have found another type of comedy that speaks to me. Maybe I'll come back round to stand up, and I'll have something to say in stand up that I find more interesting than doing characters.
Right. Something that's come up before is, and it's not always true, but oftentimes a comedian might be a writer who's learning to perform, or a performer who has to write. And you said about, you were really a writer first and foremost. Is that where you're happiest? Right? You're writing the material, and then you are then acting what you've written in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think I'm a writer first. My process is very much, I'm not someone, I know a lot of comedians will tend to write little bits and notes of parts of routines and flesh stuff out. I think particularly for stand-up that works. For character stuff, sometimes that's harder to do, because you can't necessarily get up and do a minute and a half of a character and try it out. You've pretty much got to have at least 5 minutes worth really to try with a character. So I'm generally writing a kind of new 5 minutes when I'm trying out a new character. So it is going to come from having enough written to do that. I write longhand, I write in notebooks, because I find that just helps my brain. What I'll tend to do is I'll write out a routine as it comes to me first time round. Then I'll go back and rewrite it again longhand, and often that'll be reducing it down and taking out a lot of the extraneous words, boiling it down to the bits that you need to have to just try and tighten it, or sometimes adding some stuff in because it's not quite 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I'll probably rewrite it again, and the process of doing that starts to cement the routine in my head.
Yeah.
So that kind of rewriting then starts to fix it in my head. Then I'll run it through my head a few times. I'll go out and perform it. And I find that probably the first maybe 3 or 4 times I do a new character / new routine, it's very much just remembering the words. And then probably around the 5th or 6th time, the focus then is on the performing of it and how that changes and how that tweaks. Right. So I think, writer first.
Yeah.
Because my first instinct is always remember all the words in the right order and then perform it. And then that's where some of the sort of voice and the mannerism and the tics and all that sort of stuff starts to come in once you've performed it a few times.
Yeah.
And there's varying degrees on different characters. You know, some are easier and clearer. It depends on length of time. I mean, I've been doing Dave for 2 years now, on and off. And I can pretty much be him if I need to, which sounds a little bit disturbing. But he's sort of there. And I think I am being him when I'm Dave. Whereas with some of the other characters, I'm performing them still. Right. I'm not being them yet because they're not as defined. Whereas like he's got a whole backstory in my head. I know Dave's life, and so I know things like this always sound a little. These are the sort of things that when I used to listen to, I was like, "Oh, okay, mate, you're just doing a character. Don't be so pretentious about it." But now I've started doing stuff like this. I'm like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I get it." Yeah, I see what you mean. All right, fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough.
So you mentioned that you took your show to Edinburgh this year. So how was your experience with the show? How was your experience overall of the festival?
Yeah, I feel like this isn't going to be a short answer on this one, I don't think. This was my 3rd time at Edinburgh. The first time I was going to go up to the Fringe was I planned to go up in 2020. I'm not sure what happened that year. I mean, you don't really know what happened that year, so so I didn't go then. So I went up in 22 when things were starting back up, and by which point I was doing comedy. I went up and did a load of spots and saw a load of shows. Really enjoyed it. And so last year I went up with my friend Leslie Gold. We took a split bill between us and did that for a month. And that went really well. Really enjoyed that. So I thought, okay, this year I'll try taking up something solo. You know, Leslie was doing the same. So I thought I'll take up something as a work in progress and see if I can do a run. I didn't want it to be my debut yet. I didn't feel confident enough for that. I just wanted to see if I could take up a show for a month and see what the experience was like. Yeah. I think I'm happy with this show where it is at this point. It still needs work, obviously, because it always does. You'll never ever finish a show. You'll always leave at a point where you're like, that's as close as it gets. But it still does need some work. But I'm happy with the way it's come together, because it's my initial thought for the show at the start of the year was I would do a mixture of character and stand-up. Right. Because I didn't have quite enough character material at that point to do up a full show. And 2, just I think lack of confidence. I just wasn't confident enough in the character material for it to sustain a whole show. But But then I had a think, and last year during the split bill, I tried to do a mix of doing some character and some stand up during the show. So we would sometimes split it so that it wasn't like a straight. I did 20, Leslie did 20. Maybe I'd do 10 as a character. Leslie would do some. I'd come back on as me, or mix it around in various ways.
Yeah.
And people didn't really go for the mixture of character and stand up. I think it was just a bit jarring.
Right.
And when I sat and thought about it, I was like, well, actually, now that you think about it, with your experience last year, it didn't work then for 20 minutes. So why would it work for a full show?
Right.
So during my time gigging this year, I spent time coming up with some more character bits, working on fleshing out some existing characters, and then got to a point where I was like, okay, I think I've got enough characters. How do I want to bring it together? I'd started, I think, middle of last year doing it's not a character piece exactly, but it definitely shows my leaning towards more alternative comedy. I'd started doing a piece with a puppet where it was my inner monologue, and I sort of had an argument with it about, being single and various bits and pieces. And I quite enjoyed doing that because I'm a lifelong Jim Henson fan, so any excuse to, and that led me to the thought that actually what I can use to tie the show together and to sort of have my cake and eat it a little bit is I can do a character show, but I can use the inner monologue as a framing device to actually reveal something a bit personal about myself. So I am kind of still talking about myself in the show whilst doing character stuff as well.
Yeah.
So I had the idea the inner monologue would be some pre-recorded audio I'd interact with as I got changed in between each character. So it was also a practical way to cover me getting changed in between each routine. And then I could culminate with the inner monologue coming on stage as a puppet at the end and having an argument with me. So that was the kind of through line of the show. So once I'd kind of worked that out, I spent quite a bit of time writing it and drafting it. I employed some help. I got the wonderful Shan Doxy to come on board, and she spent some time helping me, particularly on the framing stuff. I wasn't so worried about the character material because a lot of that I'd done a lot and I knew it was working, but it was the framing device coming together.
Yeah.
I booked myself into Brighton Fringe, and also Leslie was running a series of previews as part of her show, So For So Funny. She did a series of London previews there. And then also Tunbridge Wells Fringe as well. So I thought if I've got those ahead of Edinburgh, at least I can test out and see if the concept actually works, because that was the big unknown at that point, was will people actually go for this weird inner monologue concept? And I did the 2 shows in Brighton in May, and it went down really well. I had a lot of people in that I didn't know, which was good. And they laughed, which was even better. So that was really encouraging, because I was like, okay, it at least they didn't all sit at the end going, what is he doing? Why has he got a puppet? What's going on here? Is this show supposed to be? They bought into it. So I was like, okay, great. It works.
Yeah.
So then it was a case of taking it up to Edinburgh, which was, I am going to say, was a mixed bag. I did a set of video diaries all the way throughout, so I've already spoken publicly about it, so it's not a surprise. There were some shows that were great. There were some shows that had audiences that were engaged, and I had some people in and they were into it and they got it. But there were some shows that weren't, including one where I had 0 laughter all the way through. And then there were 5 that had no one turn up at all, which, out of 22 still isn't too bad. I know of people who had worse hit rates. I know of people who cancelled their run. I didn't, despite a bit of a wobble towards the end. I stayed and did the full run.
Yeah.
Obviously the best audience was the one on the last night.
Yeah.
Which included some guy called Mark. I don't really know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Don't know.
But I think it was a valuable learning experience, I learned a lot from it. I'm glad I
Yeah.
did it. I did it. I did a show at the Fringe for the entire month. I did
Yeah.
make it through. I think, I learned stuff like for my show, being in Newtown and being at the time of day I was didn't work. I need to be in a different part of town at a different time of day, I think, to get the traction for that.
Right.
The venue I was in was lovely, but it just wasn't the right fit for me. I don't think there were other shows in my venue that did really well because they were the right sort of show at the right time of day for that venue. Audience that wanted something that was that allowed the audience to be just sort of boozy, having fun, not really concentrating.
Yeah.
That sounds dismissive of the other shows. I don't mean it like that. I just mean those shows were geared towards people being looser and chipping in, being interactive, being part of the show.
Yeah.
In a way that wouldn't work as well for mine. And that's not to say my show isn't interactive. It definitely has parts that interact with the audience.
Yep.
But I don't think it's designed for like a drunken late night crowd. It's not that sort of show.
Sure.
Not to say that it couldn't work with them, but they weren't going to it. They were going to the stuff that appealed to a drunken late night crowd.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So I learned that. I learned how to adjust the show based on the audience. So for example, on one of the ones I mentioned where I didn't have a good audience response, I sort of edited the show as I went along and shortened it because I could see they weren't engaged and they didn't want to be there. So I brought it in quicker, didn't give them the full show, spared us all the grief of going through the whole thing. But I think that's a valuable lesson to learn, is that actually sometimes it's fine to bail. Equally, I had two people in one of the later shows that clearly weren't enjoying it. And so fairly early on, at a reasonable transition point between one of the characters, I gave them the option to just make a discreet exit. Not in a turfing them out kind of way, but in a now's a good time if you want to head to the bar.
Yeah.
So they took, and actually that improved the show because they weren't enjoying it, so they were bringing down the audience members who were. And by them leaving, you could see the relief on the other audience members' faces that meant they were allowed to enjoy it again. So, all those sort of things are valuable learning experiences. And I performed more comedy in the month of August than I performed in the months of January to July. And, where else are you going to get that opportunity?
Yeah.
So it was really valuable, but it was tough. I'm not going to lie, it was tough. And on the very last Friday, there was a point where I looked to see if I could get a flight home because I thought, I don't want to keep plugging away at this. Yeah. I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't. But yeah, and I had some other lovely moments outside of the show. I got to perform one of my favourite gigs, the Alternative Comedy Memorial Society, which is an London and Edinburgh staple. And because I performed, I got to be part of their silly, randomly generated awards ceremony, which was fun. Yeah. So absolutely worth it for that. And then on the last day, I got to take part in comedians performing Rocky Horror from memory, which was just a room full of 30 people singing out Rocky Horror tunes at the top of their lungs. It's just a room full of people doing Rocky Horror karaoke.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I love about Edinburgh, is that there are fringy shows that you don't see anywhere else, one-offs and every comedian in the world, it seems, is in town, Yeah. So there's going to be people around who just want to jump on the things, and you'll see the weirdest shows.
Well, that's the other glorious thing. Like, a huge chunk of your comedy mates are all up there. You bump into each other every day. You're all in the same boat. You're all going through the same thing. Yeah. I think one of the surprising things I found about comedy, which, before I came into it, before I started performing comedy myself, I'd always assumed it was a lot more everyone out for themselves, people trying to push their careers forward, people, competing for the gigs. And I'm sure there is an element of that. But I think what I found is actually it's more of a community, and it's more about supporting each other and, oh, I'm doing this gig. Do you want to do it? There's a spot here. Do you want to do that? There's a lot more of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And what I found particularly in Edinburgh is that there were lots of us just checking in on each other. You know, I'd just get messages from people saying, just checking in, how you doing? I'd send them out myself. And that really helped. I think that really helped to get through, is to know that, well, there's a lot of other people going through the same thing that you're going through. And there's some people that are having a better time, and there's some people that are having a worse time.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the nice takeaways from Edinburgh, is I feel like it strengthened some of the comedy friendships as well, because I got to spend time with people that I don't normally get to spend a lot of time with, because you go to a gig, you chat for a little bit beforehand, you chat for a little bit in the interval, you chat for a little bit at the end, then you head home. So you don't tend to hang out with people a lot necessarily. Well, I don't. I know there are people that do, but I'm 48 years old, and I've got a full-time job as well, so I can't hang out after every gig drinking as well. I get home late enough as it is. So it was nice in Edinburgh to be able to hang out with people for a bit, like your good self.
Always a pleasure.
Yes.
You said there about it being a community, and you anticipated maybe a little bit more competition, but what about comedy competitions? How do you view them? How do you fare? You were finalist last year, I think, in West End New Acts.
Yes.
So how do you approach competitions? How do you feel about competition?
I think I've been approaching them less this year. I think particularly early on, you have a strong desire to enter competitions because of what placement in a competition will do for you.
Right.
So it's something you can put on your CV. It's a shorthand to say to promoters who are booking you, I'm not shit, is really all that's saying.
Yeah.
You know, I can be relied upon to make people laugh. So you want to get something like that on your CV. I've done quite a few competitions. The West End New Act is the only one where I've really got anywhere. Honestly, you know, I've tried ones like, I've tried various competitions. I just haven't got that far in them. I think they're a difficult thing to progress in for certain types of comedy as well. I mean, there's a dedicated one for character and sketch stuff. There's Sketch Off.
Yeah.
But then obviously everyone who's a character comedian and a sketch comedian is entering that one. So the competition in that is fierce. You're going up against all the best people doing that stuff. Yeah. So it's very hard to get anywhere in a competition where the competitors are that good. And not to say that the competitors weren't good in the West End New Act. Yeah. But you know what I mean? They're good in your specialist field.
Sure.
Also, I think particularly this year, now that I have very much decided I'm a character comedian, not everyone wants character comedy. So there's it is more on the alternative side. It is more of a niche. The disadvantage with doing something like character comedy is there are gigs, there are competitions where you won't progress because it's not what they're looking for.
Right.
Which is fine. That's not the type of comedy that they're looking to use to draw people in to see the competition, etc. See the gig.
Sure.
The advantage is for alternative and character comedian, the audiences that like it really like it. So there's the potential to build up a dedicated following.
Yeah.
But that takes time and it's harder. So yeah, I slightly diverted there. But I think for me, I think at this point I've got a finalist credit on my CV, which is nice. I will probably still occasionally try and enter competitions, but I don't personally see them as a be all and end all. I quite liked what they said as a sort of pep talk when I entered So You Think You're Funny, which I didn't get anywhere in. But when I entered that, they said placing in a competition like this, all it's going to do is shortcut you by 6 months. If you're good and you put in the work, you'll still get there. It's just going to take you slightly longer. And I think that's right. I think that's the right attitude to have to competitions. All competitions will do is give you a little bit of a shortcut to say, I'm good, give me a chance.
Yeah.
If you're good and you're doing well at gigs and you're putting in the effort and going to gigs and doing all the things that promoters want from you at a gig, which is turning up on time and not overrunning and not taking the piss and being polite and, you know, all those kind of other things that seem like small things, but actually are important. when you're trying to sell yourself as a viable comedian.
Yeah.
I think if you're doing all that, they're right. You will still get to the point of somebody that's done well in that competition. It just takes you a little bit longer.
Yeah. And what about watching comedy? I know that you said about when you're in Edinburgh, you got to see other shows, and again, you raised ACMS, Alternative Comedy Memorial Society, where you have performed, and I know that you watch it regularly. You know, we bump into each other there.
Yeah.
So you do watch comedy, but do you
Yeah.
watch it with a comedian's mindset now, or are you still able to let go and be entertained?
I think I don't watch it with enough of a comedian's mindset a lot of the time. I think I should watch it more and analyze and think, oh, that's good, and I see what they've done, and I need to do stuff like that. But I think I think I just get swept up in enjoying something that's funny, and I then don't analyze it as much as I should do. I think it all seeps in. So I think for me, when I started at the tender age of 44, which is, not a traditional age for a lot of people to start comedy. There are people that do, but we're in the minority, I'd say. I had been watching comedy for the best part of 40 years, and it was all in there, and not just watching comedy. I was the sort of person that would read books about comedy and would listen to podcasts about comedy because I've always been interested in how things are done.
Yeah.
I had a phase in my 20s, teens into 20s where I wanted to be a filmmaker. So, I listened to commentaries on films and I read books about films and I read scripts so that I could understand the how and how it was done.
Yeah.
And I think I've always had that in that level of interest in comedy. That means I've always been interested in the how. So when I started doing comedy courses, when I started out, actually, although I did get a lot of useful stuff from them, a lot of what I got was, oh, actually, this is just putting a name on something This is putting the name on something you instinctively know. So I think even when I'm just watching comedy and enjoying it and taking it in, I probably am subconsciously, absorbing a lot of that, taking that in, and using some of that in ways that might help.
Yeah.
But I think, I don't consciously sit there a lot of the time and think, oh, excellent, see what I've done. Sometimes there are some times where you watch something and I'm like, okay, no, I see you've done that. It's really nice. Yeah. More often than not, I just enjoy something because it's funny and it's nice to see someone who knows what they're doing being funny.
Yeah. Are there people or events that continue to inspire you now, that push you?
Yeah, it's hard to single out a specific thing, I would say, because I think it's lots of things. Like I get I like to see peers doing well. So people I know and I gig with, I genuinely like to see them being successful because it does make me think, well, that could be me. I could reach that as well.
Yeah.
So I find that encouraging rather than discouraging. I try not to have that attitude of, well, if they're doing it, why aren't I?
Right.
Because I don't think that helps. You've got to celebrate the successes in comedy because it's tough to get. I don't know. I think my influences at the moment are definitely along the alternative character clowning side. So I'm watching a lot more of those kind of comedians to see what they're doing, to try and see how I can push it. I think, obviously, like I said, Shan Doxey helped me out, and I love what her and Tom Tuck do at ACMS, and generally the kind of acts they have on ACMS are the sort of people that I enjoy and that, yes, and I want to be like. So that's why I enjoy ACMS. I always enjoy the sort of stuff that Lorna Rose Treen and Jonathan Oldfield do. They're definitely in that sort of similar mindset. Also people like Joss Norris, people like that. That's the kind of thing. Stuart Laws. They're all in that sort of vein of comedy that appeals to me, where there's an element of they often will have an element of, particularly Joss and Stuart have an element of, well, here's behind the curtain. you know this is artificial. I know you know this is artificial. You know that I know that you know this is artificial. That kind of level of playing around with the audience is the sort of stuff I like. That's the sort of stuff I was starting to do a little bit in my stand-up. And there was an element of that to it. And I think kind of those are the people that I'm sort of drawn towards in terms of wanting to go down that same sort of path.
Yeah. So what then in these first few years do you think have been your worst and best experiences in comedy?
God, it's like there's always a little roster of worst type gigs that you can have. There's the one where I was doing a gig in a pub in Eltham where one of the locals came up to me and said his name was Terry Two-pints. Always be suspicious of someone who's given themselves their own nickname. And he told us to just get up and be funny. Yeah, none of that storytelling stuff. Just tell jokes and get out. Because he knew funny, right? Because he spent time with Jim Davidson. So that is always slightly worrying. And then proceeded to make racist comments all the way throughout everyone's sets. So that was fun. There's the gig I did in a hostel where 2 fights broke out in the same night, and a woman got thrown out for being too drunk, and it turned out she was there to apply for a job. I think there's just always nights like that. There are the ones that are kind of chaos and fun. There are the nights that shouldn't work and somehow do and end up being great fun. I did one in a shopping centre in Brixton with just people wandering around. Stood in front of a shop with an amp doing comedy to some people sat down in front of you, but then also people just walking past shopping. And somehow that shouldn't have worked. And we all had one of the most fun nights we'd ever had. We were kind of acts on the bit. I really enjoyed the weird chaos of the night. It just sort of worked. Best moments are, and every time I get to gig with someone whose comedy I really like, that's the kind of highlights in comedy. To think that I've had examples where I've gigged with someone where I was like, well, I watched you on TV in the 90s when I was growing up and loved your comedy, and now I'm sharing a stage with you. Or you're someone whose comedy specials I watched before I started doing comedy, and I've come off stage and you've said, I really loved what you're doing. It's like it's little things like that are nice. And then, although I've said it was tough, I spent a month doing my own show in Edinburgh, and that is absolutely a highlight. And that's 3.5 years after starting comedy. When I started 3.5 years ago, the idea of writing 10 minutes seemed insane. And I've done a show on my own, and it might not have felt like it at points during the time, but it's a highlight when you sort of step away from it and look back. It's also sometimes it's hard to pick out the lowlights and the highlights because you gig a lot and it all starts to blur into one a little bit after a while. On average, I do 10 to 12 gigs a month. It's working full time. And after a while, it starts to blur a little bit.
Nick, how can we find out about you and where we can see you perform?
You can find me on Instagram at that baldy fella. You can also find me on Twitter, but I don't really use it anymore, if I'm being perfectly honest. I'm also part of a set of gigs called So Funny Tuesdays, the aforementioned Sofa So Funny run by Leslie Gold. There's also What's So Funny run by Jacob Hatton. And every time there's a 5th Tuesday in the month, I'll be running So Odd, So Funny, which is an alternative night. And that starts for the first time on 29th of October, 2024. So you can find So Odd, So Funny as well on Instagram. And just generally lurking around wherever there's an open mic gig, you'll probably find me there doing some sort of character. I'll be the bald one with the beard, probably wearing a high vis at some point.
And so my final question then is, as always, how would you sum up comedy in a nutshell?
Comedy in a nutshell. Yeah, you did tell me you were going to ask this, and I really should have thought of an answer, shouldn't I, in advance?
Well, it would certainly buck the trend of 90 episodes if you had thought about it in advance. Everyone always seems surprised by the question.
Yeah, how would I sum up comedy in a nutshell? I think for me, it's something that is just become a way of life for me. Comedy is something that I enjoy watching, reading, listening to, and it's something I enjoy doing. And I think the surprising thing is doing it hasn't lessened my enjoyment of seeing it yet. Ask me that question again in 4 years' time.
Nick, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. The pleasure was all mine.